Now let's take a look at some of the history and concepts of observability. Let's start with its origins. Where did this all start, and how did we get to start thinking about observability the way we do today? And then we'll take a look at some of the core concepts of observability. You curious yet? Well, let's get into it. Now, where did this all start? Observability is not a new term. In fact, its history dates back to about half a century ago, in the early 1950s and the 1960s, long before microservices were even a thing. It was first introduced by a Hungarian-American scientist called Rudolf E. Kalman in 1959. Now, interestingly, this was introduced in the paper called On the General Theory of Control Systems, and that paper is still around today. In fact, I was able to find the paper from sciencedirect.com. And here you have the first paper that introduced the concept of observability. And if I click on View PDF, we can actually view this paper. Now, I wouldn't bore you reading all the content of this paper, but if I do a quick search for the term observability in here, you will actually see that the first appearance of the word observability here tells us about its introduction. It says in section 6, we introduce the concept of observability and solve the problem of reconstructing unmeasurable state variables from the measurable ones in the minimum possible length of time. Now, I'll leave a link to this paper in the resources section if you want to dive a bit deeper. While the idea may seem self-evident now, it was groundbreaking at the time. Kalman's paper wasn't aimed at addressing the complexities of system management as engineers do today. Rather, his work on observability was a component of a larger endeavor to define what constitutes a system and to outline the methods for controlling such a system. Kalman was at the forefront of developing new ideas in signal processing and systems theory. As we can see from the paper, he was not a computer scientist by trade, and in 1959, he certainly did not envisage how this concept of observability would later be adapted for software management. The next phase is what I call the emergent period in the 1990s. Primarily, the concept of observability was confined to signal processing and systems theory until it gained prominence in the computing world. Now, interestingly, in 1999, Sun Microsystems defined observability as the primary prerequisite for performance management and capacity planning. Now, this perspective stands in contrast to the current understanding where application performance management, or APM, is often viewed just as one facet of observability, rather than observability being a precursor to APM. Yet, it's important to note that professionals at Sun Microsystems at the time were not dealing with the kind of complex, intricate, distributed applications that observability is typically associated with today. Now, the next phase is what I call the expansion, and this is the 2010s to 2016s. A lot of credit for the popularity of the term observability goes to platforms like Twitter and Google, who actually started sharing their approaches to observability around mid-2016s. Now, while still drastically different from what we know it to be today, it was the closest thing we had yet. Conferences also started talking about observability at this time. And then finally, you have the modern age till today. Today, observability has become a critical necessity for sophisticated, complex applications. Developers, IT teams, DevOps teams all consider it to be a necessary element of such systems. Now, we can't talk about the history of observability without talking about what telemetry is. As we've seen, the term observability comes from the field of control theory. In this context, a system is said to be observable if its current state can be determined in a finite amount of time or in a finite period of time using only its outputs. This system output is what's known as telemetry. And as you can see in the image on the screen, this is a very classical example of what an observable system will be like. You have telemetry devices collecting telemetry data, and then transmitting this over the wire to, say, an antenna, which is then passed on to central signal processing server. And now from the signal processing server, these signals that have been collected can then be exported to maybe a central monitoring server, or maybe an ECG bedside monitoring display where you can actually view the delta or changes in signals over time.